Okay, welcome everyone to Duncan's workshop.
So the first note I have to make is, obviously I'm looking at the laptop screen in order to get the lecture slides, because apparently if I move that, something horrible happens. So I might occasionally forget to change the lecture slides, so just like let me know if that's happened. So I'll try and remember to sync up. So we're going to structure this in the following way. I'm going to have some preliminary notes that I think are relevant to just thinking about cracking IR debates and so on. And then the second half is probably the longer half. So we'll have that break in the middle if people want to go on to the practice debates. The second half, which is a much longer half, is attempts to talk about first principles of IR. So a couple of preliminary notes to explain kind of where this talk comes from. So the first is, I see there as being almost a tension between theory of IR and reality or practice of IR, at least in debating, which is very well summed up for, if you watch nothing else on international relations, worth watching this. There's an International Square debate which has both Kevin Rudd, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia, who was also involved in Australian diplomacy with China prior to becoming the Prime Minister, and John Mearsheimer, who, for those of you who do international relations, will be aware is one of the contemporary mainstream, I'm not sure what they're called, neo-realists, just realists writing today. And Mearsheimer argues that, in terms of the motion, the US and China are long-term enemies and must be enemies because the US can't allow it to be a peer competitor in the world. So inevitably, they're going to come into conflict because China's interests and the US interests in terms of who's the hegemon within the Asian region are going to be butting heads. This is inevitably going to result in conflict. And Kevin Rudd's like, inevitably, like, who says this, right? You know, like, these are reasonable people, neither of them want wars. I've been a diplomat, we can sit in rooms and discuss things. Like, why, just because your abstract theory says there will be war, is this war truly inevitable? Like, why on earth would theory that way? And I think it's a very interesting exchange because you see two people that are preeminent, one in terms of the practice of international relations and one in terms of the theory of international relations. And I think it also explains how I think about IR in debating, which is most talks about how to do IR in debating are like, well, there are these theories, there's realism and there's new realism and liberalism and neo-constructivism. And I find them completely useless for actually applying any of those thoughts to debating. By and large, any time spent saying, well, realists would say that's concerned debating, don't tend to win you debates, as far as I've discovered. So the second thing, which is what informs the second part of this talk, is some of you may have seen, but you haven't seen, some very good lectures online as part of Monash debating societies. I think, well, now people can't see the screen.
That's all right.
Okay. As part of Monash debating societies online lectures by a guy called Tim Sonnerich, who is very well known within Australasia, but comparatively less well known within Australasia, who is, at least his theory of how to lecture on debating has been very important to me, which is group around first principles. The thought being that, well, it might be fun to have me lecture about, you know, Iraq for an hour. That's not going to be very useful to you in debates that don't necessarily involve Iraq. But if we try and look at, say, a wide swath of international relations debate and say, okay, what are the common principles or these common concepts that crop up in a large number of debates? Thinking about those are useful to then cross-apply those to a multitude of other debates, especially when you get something like round 8 at Euros this year, for those of you that were there and indeed that weren't there, which was deliberately set to challenge people because, hey, here is an IR debate that they probably don't know that much about. Finally, just this thought recently, which will be familiar to those of you who was Dan Hab's lecture this morning. I think there's an interesting trade-off between the kind of cynicism or realism, as you might think, that I think is best as a stance anyway for thinking about international relations in the theoretical, and the actual requirements on you as a debater when you're thinking about how to approach IR debates, which is this. In a this house believes debate, or this house believes that debate, if it's not linked to an actor, then to some extent it takes place in terms of the interests of general humanity. Now, the odd paradox with that within international relations is, by and large, in international relations, you're thinking about what states would do in terms of what states' self-interest is. Now, that probably isn't very similar to the interests of general humanity. I'm not sure what in international relations general humanity is interested in. I think the answer to that might be human rights. That might be the well-being of the average person within the Crimea. But note that if we were looking at large state international relations, America's interest in the Crimea and what happens in the Crimea versus Russia's interest in what happens in the Crimea, I don't think there's many people involved in that equation who are interested in the well-being of like the average Crimean. I mean, that might be horribly cynical, but it's an interesting problem, I think, in terms of setting international relations debates. I think this problem is very easily set by saying that international relations debate probably function better actors debates, and they do take place from the point of view of a designated actor that says, you know, this house believes that America thus and so, or this house believes that's in Russia's interest thus and so. So I frankly disagree with the announcement that those of you who are at Euros will have heard, where people are like, well, we don't have any actors debates at this competition because we don't think that actors debates are very useful. I think international relations are the very obvious case in which they are extremely useful, because international relations debates probably require a point of view to make sense. And the point of view of general humanity, which tends to be what people say the point of view is for this house believes that debates, doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense within an international relations context, because in reality, most of the actors in international relations context are not acting from the interests of general humanity. They are at best acting from the interests of their people, and at worst, and it's most cynical, acting from the interests of, say, the ruling elites that happen to control any particular country, which is probably not the same as general humanity or whatever you think the point of view is for Sainsbury's now. Okay, so so we're not going to analyze all these, but they're worth writing down so we can refer back to them. I will try and mentally remind myself to refer back to them. I was going to have them on the screen in front of me, but I will occasionally, hopefully, at the very least, when we're doing the first principles, relate back to them. I suggest maybe one thing that could be done if we were doing practice debates is to set one of them as a practice debate. So just to chat through them briefly, given the wrong screen while people are writing. The first, I think, is interesting, at least because you do better in the first debate the more actors you can think of and the more actors you engage with, and the depth at which you engage with them. So this is a debate that I often like to set as an example of debate for international relations discussions, for the simple reason that if you just look at it and you're like, well, this is about nuclear weapons, this is about mutually assured destruction, there isn't really that much material in the debate. But when you're thinking about it from the point of view of actors and their interests, a lot more material starts to make itself available. Is it in the interest of the United States that there be more mutually assured destruction within the context of the Korean Peninsula, and therefore, at least in theory, it'd be less likely that it results in a war? Will this antagonize China? Is that in the US interests? Will it help to avoid antagonism with China, because now you have, as it were, an arm's length approach to South Korea, being like, well, when South Korea is acting, that's not us, you know, guaranteeing it, that's an independent actor? Or is that in fact an incredibly bad thing from the US point of view, because that means you've lost a degree of leverage with regards to South Korea? Again, these are concepts we're going to discuss in a moment. This house supports the creation of a European army versus this house supports Japanese remilitarization. So in both these cases, I think you have the question of, is the creation of a separate armed state a good thing or a bad thing for international diplomacy generally? Is it good because it means you have more of a credible threat against your neighbors? Is it bad because it may antagonize those neighbors? And note that many of the same arguments are engaged regardless of what context we're setting this in. So many of the same reasons you might think that a separate European military state was good or bad. It gives independence from America, that might be good or a bad thing. It creates a degree of friction and threat towards the powerful neighbor, whether that be China in the case of Japan, or whether that be Russia in the case of Europe. And it has the risk of creating a military-industrial complex that we assume this involves like a large-scale increase in military. Again, in either of these debates, the same arguments are engaged, despite the fact that the context and the details within those contexts are different. This house believes Kashmir should strive for independence rather than unification with Pakistan. I think I'm going to pick up that more in terms of discussion of context and discuss it now. This house believes the US should withdraw nuclear missiles from Turkey. I want to talk about this mainly in relation to the arguments I'm making later about signaling and why signaling is important in our debates, because in some ways, I think the more you chew on this motion, especially the more you chew on it in terms of details, a lot of the high impact debate, arguments that a lot of people would be really attracted to in this, rebels or Kurdists or Islamists might storm nuclear bases in Turkey and have nukes and blow stuff up, don't make any sense. Not in reality. Like the Turkish army guards the base, the US army guards the base. Like no one is going to get nuclear weapons and blow stuff up. The reality is, I think, this debate makes most sense as an almost zero impact debate, which is largely about signaling and saying what are the effects of the US making this action in terms of what it signals to Turkey, what it signals to the Turkish people about the US's confidence in the Turkish government, what it signals to other actors in the region. So I think this is an important debate for thinking about, just think about signals within IR. And then finally, this actually sanctioned the military, political and intelligence leadership of Pakistan. I think this is an interesting debate for thinking about the way in which relationships within a state can influence IR policy. So again, I want to pick that up in the substantive or the discussion. As a second to last topic before we start talking about first principles, oops. As I told you, I'm probably going to forget the different screens. So we should probably just ask ourselves what an international relations motion is. I find particularly UK and American debaters are often very hostile to the idea that a motion which involves other countries they feel that's an IR debate. So I've got a complaint here because I've said a motion about education within Israel-Palestine. Well, that's kind of an IR debate. And you're like, well, it's not really. From an Israeli point of view, a debate about Israeli education is very much a domestic debate. World is an international format. That's not to say that you're necessarily required to know everything about everywhere, but international relations debates probably are best understood as debates that engage relations between nations. Now, obviously, there are some debates that do involve some degree of domestic policy as well as international relations. I think this is a fascinating example. So maybe discuss that in 2 seconds. Oh, forget which screen I'm on. The first is an example of a debate that some of you may have seen me debating if you've seen our Chennai WUDC Final. This is a really interesting case where there's 2 sets of arguments, one of which is a moral argument about the military culpability for war crimes and whether or not individuals should be seen as culpable for those war crimes because of the fact that they were part of the Japanese imperial military and so on and so forth. And a secondary set of arguments that is entirely to do with the geopolitics in the region and the signal that Japan, by doing this, would set to other actors in the region. The interesting thing, at least for me, for this debate, is if you look at all the teams that went through from proposition, and there aren't many of them, the one thing they all have in common is they discuss the second set of arguments, which say the geopolitical arguments, at least as well as the first set. So myself and John did both because we kind of had a panic during prep and was like, let's throw every argument we can think at in the debate, and it turns out the geopolitics ones were the correct ones. Cambridge, Rebecca, Cambridge B? Yes, so Cambridge B decided to junk all the moral and military arguments immediately and just said, the greatest acts are sometimes built upon noble lies, so we're just going to talk about geopolitics. The Harvard extension was the geopolitics stuff with their opening team having run the military moral stuff. OG did not go through, Harvard did go through. So it's interesting that the geopolitics one's there, even though they're not necessarily the first set of arguments you may be thinking of when you look at that motion, turned out to be the winning arguments, at least for the proposition. Just in terms of the second motion, which is my version of a debate from Amsterdam Euros, what arguments do you think of when you see that motion? I like to think there's a wide range of arguments, which includes both domestic arguments and arguments could probably be construed as international relations arguments. Just shout things. No one thinks of any arguments. Deeply worrying.
Makes it more likely that they can diversify their economy.
They can diversify their economy. I mean, in terms of the natural resource extraction, it probably doesn't change it that much. But in terms of what's saying this decentralizes it and then people conserve and then people load up. Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Since their environmental storage bad. It's fair to give them money.
It's fair, okay. Maybe.
Yeah.
So it's fair because people own
because like the extraction has had a negative effect on Nigeria. So it's,
Oh, but that's weird because we're giving it to people that live nowhere near the extraction zones as well, right? So presumably giving it to everyone. In fact, I can't remember. This is my rewrite of it. So the original may say it to all citizens.
Seems an awfully inefficient way to redistribute tax revenue.
Maybe. So efficiency in terms of the government spending things on projects like infrastructure, projects like schools and hospitals versus individuals spending that money. As pointed out a moment ago, you might be able to turn that around and say, well, individuals spending that money is better because either they're going to spend it through consumption and build up local economies that way. You know, you're generating kind of artificial middle class that way. Or alternatively, it's just better because they're going to distribute in a way that's more fair, that is less subject to patronage. So a lot of the natural advantages you might think are useful to try and develop in the rest of the country, you can develop this way. The Harish and Michael argument when they did this, but in Iraq for some reason, as the Durham Open Final, you remember, was largely about how you cut out corruption because now people have an understanding of exactly what they're owed by the natural resource extraction. So there's a dollar amount or a lira amounts that they can say, okay, this is the money I am owed, and I can track that.
You're gonna get a little more extraction.
You might do, yeah, because now there's a vested interest in increasing the amount of extraction. That is definitely true.
Yeah. So like this is against a practice that a lot of rentier states would do, which is take the natural resource and then give as much proceedings as possible to the population. And that's bad because it diminishes the amount of vertical accountability that could exist between the citizens and the state. If the state is just seen as an arbiter of giving goods and services to the citizens.
Which sounds like a good argument. When you think about it, that's true on the other side as well, right? On the other side,
yeah.
The government's getting this money and it's choosing who to give it to.
Right.
So in some ways that could be worse, right?
Yeah.
In some ways you're cutting that process out at the very least because now people are like, oh, well, this is money I'm owed as opposed to money the state is giving me. So that might be bad because it means that I get less buy-in to the state because I don't feel the state is giving me this money. But it might be good because it removes some of those tensions that are causing non-state actors, which is when I think the international relations aspect of this kicks in. So if you believe, and it's certainly plausible, that a lot of non-state actors, and in the case of Nigeria, Boko Haram, are motivated in part by a sense of antagonism towards the state, or the Niger Delta Liberation League, is that what they're called? The people operating in the south of Nigeria as opposed to the north, are motivated by resentment that the state is profiting off these resources. So either people are mad at the state because of ethnic patronage, or people are mad at the state because they feel they should be getting most of these oil money and they're not getting any. These people are motivated in part by things that can be addressed by this. So by thinking about it in those ways and saying, okay, we cut out the kind of patronage networks that Devon was talking about, by cutting out those patronage networks, then it might be the case that we remove some of the non-state, anti-state resentment, and by doing so, we cut out the negative effects of those groups. And some of those effects are international. So some of those effects are things like the spillover conflict we get from Boko Haram. And similarly in the case of, like, this house believes in nationalism, again, this is somewhere in between the kind of education within Israel, which I really don't think is an international relations debate, even though obviously you need to know, unless you are Israeli, something about nations which are not your own. And the other debates that do engage directly in international relations arguments, insofar as many of the more interesting examples, I think, of this, which might be relevant to this debate. So thinking about the way nationalism plays out in Turkey, the way nationalism plays out in France, the way nationalism plays out in Tanzania, I think knowing about these things probably helps inform this debate, and probably also has a knock-on effect in terms of the way states relate to each other, which might be one way. Which didn't necessarily, so this was the Manila final, didn't necessarily get run much in the Manila final, but I think could be ways to think about that debate. So it's very difficult to say exactly which motions are international relations motions and which are not. But broadly speaking, this lecture will assume we're talking about motions which engage interactions between states. So the first, how do I go backwards? Do I double tap? Previous, there we go. Left arrow might be an easier way. Okay, so, and this will be the last thing before we do the kind of split. Just in terms of how to analyze international relations debates in prep. So one, hopefully confident note, in BP, are we in the wrong one? Oh, okay, sorry, this is the second last slide. Whoops, forgot this one existed. So this is a list that probably is best if you don't write down. I'm certainly not going to chew through it at this point. Of what strikes me is the kind of essential examples that are worth knowing something about. And in the context of debating, something literally just means one, reading the Wikipedia page on it, and second, if there is a Council on Foreign Relations background, which there often is on many of these topics, reading that Council on Foreign Relations background on it. There is also, note at the end, very nice book. Often the books that are most useful to have with you in debating change from year to year as then books fall out of print. So this CBS World Guide used to be a very good thing about 6 years ago, but now hasn't been reprinted, so 6 years out of date, or possibly 8 years out of date. Similarly, there's a book called the Oxford Guide to World Countries. Very handy, hasn't been reprinted for 3 or 4 years, less handy. This rather useful publication from The Economist printed, I think, last year, so maybe don't rely on it to say exactly where the borders in the Syrian conflict are today, but for most topics, and because, as it says, it focuses primarily on the kind of contentious world issues that would be relevant to most of the debates you'd be asked to have, might be a useful thing to just have with you, just in case you're hit with a motion that you know nothing about. Do people want me to leave that on the screen a little bit longer? Okay. So this is maybe not an exhaustive list, but I mean, note that like the topics that would appear on this or a similar list probably change from year to year. So where's my that's why it's not moving on the screen, because it's a different screen. So I mean, the India-Pakistan conflict and Kashmir that went with it was an example in 2011 of a topic that people would set, much like the Venezuela debate, at Euros because no one knew anything about it. Whereas now it's very much in the media constantly, and indeed when I objected to a Kashmir motion being set at any EUDC, I was told, well, no, it's in the headlines every day, so people should know something about this. And I thought, well, why? I don't know that much about it, but fair enough. Okay, good to...
Yeah, just a question.
Yep.
Does the CIA World Factbook kind of fit that genre pretty well? Or
I mean, I don't, I mean, this is one that I'm happy enough to open up to the floor. I've never found it particularly useful because it seems to be mostly facts as opposed to descriptors of those things. So I mean, one thing that I think was fun about the Oxford Guide to World Countries is it goes a bit deeper into things like the economy of the country and some of the historical background of the country, which, as we're going to discuss in a moment, can be useful to international relations. Whereas I find the CIA Factbook just doesn't. Like, I don't need to know that a country exports timber. I need to know who gets the money from the timber export, who owns the timber exporting companies. You know, these are useful facts. The amount of timber that is actually exported is probably not. Similar with regards to the Oxford. So the Oxford Guide to World Countries has helped me out on at least one occasion. Some of you might have been at the Ljubljana IB maybe 2 years ago, maybe not. Very, very old. There was a motion there about breaking up the, gosh, I've forgotten the Daewoo Chaebol. Yeah, so break up the Chaebol, which are the South Korean super companies, so Daewoo, Samsung. Is there a car company one? No. But there is 4, and there was a 5th one. And the fun thing the Oxford Guide to World Countries had to tell you is why there wasn't a 5th one anymore, which is it went bankrupt in the largest corporate bankruptcy in history. And we were OG, and I thought, well, this sounds like a fascinating fact, as does the fact that the current president of South Korea, or the previous president of South Korea, used to be an executive at one of those companies. And you're like, well, this revolving door argument just kind of makes itself at that point. So useful to have something that provides at least some basic background information about lots of countries. I never found the CIA World Factbook particularly helpful, but other people might, and it makes sense to find something you think is helpful for you. Page. So just in terms of that last bit, so one of the fun things about BP is, given the way the rounds sort themselves, you tend to be in rounds with people of approximately the same level of debating as you are in terms of experience, in terms of ability, and therefore it's reasonably likely that other people probably don't know much more than you do about a topic. So if you see a topic and you're horrified by it, you're like, I don't know nothing about this. Why would Latin American countries engage in a military coup against in support of the military takeover of Venezuela? I don't know. Other people within your room probably don't know what the answer to that question is either, which is useful. And unless you've been incredibly negligent in your prep, if you probably have at least some information that you can use to back things up. So the best thing to do, start off with, is try and come up with a list of the actors you think are engaged in the debate. So this means both international actors, but it also means domestic actors. And often one thing that people neglect in international relations debate is remembering, and this will be something that again we engage when we're talking about first principles in international relations, that domestic actors are incredibly important because the main people who are decision makers often care about those domestic actors as well. So obviously in democracies, you care about the interests of your democratic populace and what they think, but in non-democracies as well, there are certain domestic actors that you need to care about. Most notably the army, the faction immediately surrounding you. If your regime depends upon, say, a certain ethnic group, their interests and what their concerns are likely to be. So in terms of thinking about actors, you may want to try and figure out within your policy who is winning from this policy, who is gaining, and who is losing. In terms of the country in general, who it is that actually makes the decisions and what they care about. So a lot of the times in debates about Russia, people rely on a kind of rough characterization, put in evil, put in not evil, put in good. Realistically, he has domestic concerns. He needs to, the Russian population concern themselves with stability a lot of the time. A lot of the time they have memories of democratization in Russia, which wasn't exactly the most fun or stable time. So they're likely to be willing to support someone who seems relatively like they're able to provide them with a stable country. And so the question presumably then is, how well can he project to the Russian population that he is producing a stable country and that the country under him is likely to be one in which people can prosper, in terms of what he needs to care about in terms of his own longevity. He presumably needs to signal to people that are immediately around him that might be in a position to take over from him that it's not a good idea to take over from him because he's still able to project strength. He's still, the worry would be if he's seen as being weak, then he might be ousted by people that think they could do a better job than him. So this is probably more what motivates the decision made by the leadership of Russia than, say, a generic evilness or a generic wish to take over the world or these kind of things. Similarly, for other actors that you might think, well, you're going to do rogue state actor analysis. The roguest state in the world, probably North Korea, still does have some realistic concerns about stability within the country, about the interests of the people that the regime cares about, namely the military elites within that country, and have to care about the interests of other people within the international stage, namely China, because those countries prop them up. So when all these actions are engaged, the capacity of that actor to act in irrational ways is constrained by those concerns. One thought, which I've stolen from Harish, analogies are often unhelpful if you just make them directly. So if you just say, I think this case is a lot like this other case. That can be weak argumentation because it can be broken relatively easily by someone pointing out why those cases aren't analogous. So why there are differences between the country you're making an analogy to and another country. So the example he gives is the Botswana World's motion that the SADC should form an economic community, so a political union between what is currently a trading bloc. And obviously, a European team would see an analogy there to the European Union. Now, if you just say in a big government, well, this is a lot like the European Union, that is not going to be helpful argumentation. But if you instead analogize from, which is to say you take the example of the European Union and you say, okay, we're going to think about the ways in which the very structure that exists within the European Union are useful for the functioning of that European Union, of the functioning of any kind of similar economic body, then you can get a lot of useful material which is less apt to just be dismissed away by saying, well, it's all based on this analogy, so we don't need to care about that any more than we care about the analogy. So think about analogous cases in your prep time and extract from them the general principles that you think could apply to this context, even if you're not necessarily that sure, and even if you're not incredibly familiar with the context, rather than just stating to the judges that you think this analogy exists, because then it seems the argument rests on the analogy as opposed to the underlying principled reasons why those structures would be in place in one case, or those forces would be in place in one case and another. Finally, narratives are often very important in motivating very strong cases. So those of you that are either at Euros or alternatively have seen the Euros ESL final will note that the closing government case, in some ways, that's why I probably shouldn't have considered this stream, because every so often I'm going to say mean things about people. The closing government case, in its facts, is not necessarily that persuasive. So Russia doesn't particularly care about Ukraine for grain production. Like, this is not the 1970s. However, when it's what, 1940s, 1930s, like Russia can buy grain in the international market. However, the narrative that is used to motivate that argument in the final was incredibly persuasive. So the narrative goes like this: these states will be breaking away anyway. Given that breakaway is going to happen, is it useful or not for the United States or the West? I can't remember. I've said the US. I think the original motion was the West. Is it useful for the West to fight against that if the process is inevitable, or is it useful for them to seem like the good guys and be on the side of that and maybe have some degree of influence in that? When you give that narrative to the case, then it becomes very difficult to actually mount a successful opposition to it. Similarly, this motion that I think almost all, for some reason I've said the USE, I don't know, maybe I just can't type. So that should be an A. So the USA should withdraw from East Asia and cede regional hegemony to China. I think it's fair to say, and certainly the statistics say, that almost all teams had big problems with this from proposition. That is in some ways because a lot of people would think, well, this in some ways is an opposition argument in and of itself. You are ceding regional hegemony to China, a generically evil actor. Thankfully, as is rare sometimes, but on this occasion, the top room or the second top room for this debate, that's okay. Either the top room or the second top room that you will recognize some people from if you watch it. The closing government case actually won, and the closing government case was again built around this same kind of narrative. Ironically, the same narrative, a narrative of inevitability, but in this case saying, well, look, it is inevitable that China is going to rise in the region. It's inevitable that the US will not be able to sustain its presence in the region. So this debate is now narrowed down to the following choice. Given that's the case, do you want to make a organized and unforced withdrawal from the region and seem like, you know, the good guy and be able to negotiate with China for what kind of conditions that withdrawal takes place under? Or do you want to wait and have a humiliating, forced from economic circumstances, disorganized withdrawal from the region? And faced with that choice, suddenly the prop seems a much better idea, right? So again, sometimes the narrative with which you attach to these cases can be crucially important. And so I think one thing that teams maybe think of, not as much as they should during prep time, is what kind of narrative do we want to try and push? So once you've tried to arrange in your head the various actors you think are significant, you may want to think about what kind of narrative you want to sell to judges. Do you want to say this is a case where you need to be more concerned about the short term rather than long term because in the long run we're all dead? Is this something where you want to say, well, look, certain of these things are going to happen anyway. There's no way you're going to be able to resist it. So this is literally just about how it is that you're going to manage an inevitable process. In which case, sometimes quite hard arguments can sometimes become a lot easier, as the case with the regional hegemony point of view argument. If we think back to what we were saying. Ooh, here we go. What was that one? If we think back to what we were talking about in the Turkey example there, one of the narratives. Oh, dear. Oh, that's not good at all. Yes. So if we think back to the Turkey example there, again, one of the things you can be trying to do from prep is saying, look, maybe we could just get rid of all of these kind of high impact, maybe people will get nukes arguments and just say this isn't anything to do with that. This is about the signal you sent out. That's probably maybe something you'd be thinking about more from second prop than you would be from opening government. Maybe opening government do go for the high impact arguments. But certainly narratives can be a useful way to try and retreat to from bottom half. Switch forward. So, I mean, I think this is the point at which people who want to go off and do a practice debate, it might make sense for them to break off, because the next segment of this is we're going to be discussing a number of what strike me as being important first principles or concepts that are engaged in a variety of different international relations studies.
Fantastic. So, who would be interested in stepping up to have a debate? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Would one of those people be happy to judge with me? Roughly? Okay, well, would all of those people like to step up and let's have a debate? The workshop will continue. This is also a useful time to point out to everybody in the screen. Keep asking questions, Duncan will answer them, Drew will read them out to you, and then you can answer them as they come. Okay, the screen continues. Everyone who wants to have a debate, step outside. Thanks a lot, guys. Sorry,
Before you move on, sure. All right, so we were talking about world occupying a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Geopolitics versus the moral arguments. When do you know which arguments are prioritized in those?
Well, we didn't, so we just did both. I won't lie, the geopolitics arguments kind of came on the fly because we were like, well, I've run the moral argument, but I don't have enough material, so I thought I'll throw in the geopolitics argument. And weirdly enough, it turned out to be the winning argument. So, sorry, stream, if that spoils your theory of debates. I think certainly if you're an opening team, you don't necessarily know which arguments are going to get the most play within the debate. The easiest way to think about that, and this is more generic advice than advice specifically to IR debates, the easiest way to maybe make that kind of decision is just ask yourself, okay, as a sensible person, what would I run from the other side? What would I run from op? And then think about how to clash with that. But a lot of the time, and this is why I'm somewhat skeptical of burden identification as a thing to try and explain to people how to think about crime. The reason being, burdens, like what a team needs to prove to win a debate, are set by the debate, not set by the motion. So the arguments, let me give you a good example. Did you watch one of the quarterfinals of Cambridge?
Yes.
Which quarter?
Oh, no, we did.
Okay, so the quarterfinal with Leiden, Cambridge, Vermont, and Harthouse in it. Opening opposition. Curtis, you watched this one?
No. I just remember seeing that they were in the round together.
Okay, so the one with so what Cambridge do from opening opposition is they say, hey, by bailing out the homeowners, that money is going to go to the banks. So this is like giving money to the banks. Whereas if we are bailing out the banks, we can demand that they fire their management, or we can demand that they regulate their practices. And so the problem with prop is prop creates moral hazard and just rewards bankers for bad actions. And you're looking at this going, no, that's the prop case. How can they run the prop case from opening opposition? But no one from prop says this, and they, broadly speaking, get away with it. Now, obviously, if that happens in a then certainly one thing that you should note as a bottom half team, but like just in terms of like the abstract description of the debates, if opening opposition get away with running the prop case from opposition, the burdens on that debate have completely shifted from any kind of a priori chat that you might have had during prep times about what should prop prove in this debate, what should op prove. So a lot of the time what the burdens are for a team to prove are set dynamically by the debate they're in. And I think that's true of that debate as well. So if everyone said, okay, this is only a debate about the morality or not of punishing people within the Japanese military, then it's harder for it not to be about that. But that's in some ways an argument for what I think we alluded to in passing. My position, which is opening teams should try and make the debate about as many things as humanly possible, because otherwise you risk a closing team saying, actually, this debate is about this one thing that we want to talk about, that no one in top half did talk about. And it's hard for an opening team to get around that problem. Other than just saying preemptively, this debate is only about the things that we're talking about and can't be about anything else. But you don't tend to find that judges will make them stick to it. So some principles of IR. So the first couple are ones that do play in more directly to IR theory. So there is a lot of nice IR textbook support on this. Get out nice IR textbook. The first is sovereignty. This is oddly one that a lot of junior intermediate debaters like to run as arguments, but doesn't tend to have much weight within debates, I've found, in practice, because some of you have taught about introduction to international relations classes, but in practice, agree, disagree?
Yeah.
Yes, so sovereignty arguments don't tend to go anywhere, in part because, and this might be a sophisticated reason that you can give if you're ever faced with a sovereignty argument. Since the UN adopted what's called responsibility to protect, which is a doctrine that says sovereignty is voided under certain conditions, namely the most obvious of which is if you are engaged in significant abuse of a group within your population, then sovereignty ceases really to be a barrier. Sovereignty is relevant insofar as other countries or certain countries are concerned with maintaining its relevance and importance. So, for example, a lot of the times when China justifies its vetoing of UN actions, or alternatively just when it is acting on the world stage, deciding how it feels about a conflict, a lot of the time it will be motivated by a desire to maintain some semblance of the norm of sovereignty, saying you shouldn't interfere with other countries, because it doesn't want other countries interfering with it. So sovereignty can become relevant in that sense, but by and large, sovereignty is no longer a barrier to international action. So much as there are practical barriers, such as the UN Security Council, that might be relevant, at least on a, can we justify action in these cases? Responsibility to protect trumps sovereignty. In most of the cases, you'd be reasonably concerned about it. So sovereignty is usually not worth talking about. I think if you were wanting a good articulation of both sovereignty and the ways in which sovereignty can be voided, ironically, one of the best and most succinct sources to go to would be the PM speech in the 2011 WUDC Final, where he both says, well, look, opposition might want to talk about sovereignty, but here are 3 ways that sovereignty can be voided and has been voided in this case. So a nice 7-minute introduction to sovereignty from that PM speech. Geography. So when thinking about realism, one of the stock features of our realism is to say that a lot of the time the interests of states are fixed by certain unchanging facts about those states. And one of those unchanging facts to some extent is geography. So geography of a state doesn't change when its government changes. That's why to some extent some of the international relations issues surrounding Iran, say, were the same regardless of whether it was being ruled by the Shah in a quasi-fascist, pro-Western, pro-market state, and when it was being ruled by the current theocratic government in, you know, a, I guess, somewhat controlled economy, a centralized authority governed by a elite of clerics. Some of the foreign relations of Iran are still the same because, like, whether or not, regardless of who is controlling the country, they need to concern themselves with who rules the Strait of Hormuz, right? So, which is the water channel that gets into the Indian Ocean. So that, at the very least, remains fixed. So a lot of the kind of things that would follow from geographical facts remain the same. A couple of good examples of this. So Russia had its fleet in the port of Sevastopol in the Crimea. This is probably the predominant reason that you got the Russian agitation within Crimea and the annexation of it. Obviously, people could say, well, this is, you know, Russia's desire to unite all Russian peoples within Russia, but there doesn't seem to be that much evidence for that being true. Rather, the concerns about the treatment of ethnic Russians in other countries can be a convenient excuse that the Russian government can point to justify those actions. But the real strategic reason appears to be that there is a genuine practical concern about the need to maintain control over what was their predominant warm water port that happened to be within the Crimea. Another interesting example of this would be Kashmir. Obviously, India has a lot of symbolic importance that's attached to Kashmir, but also it has a lot of practical concerns with who rules Kashmir, some of which range from the defensive. So, as I put in the lecture slide, the headwaters of the Indus, which is one of the main rivers for India, flow Kashmir, or the like hills that Kashmir is in, or contained within Kashmir, to the what you might call offensive. So the extent to which Pakistan has a border with China depends upon the extent to which it controls Kashmir. If it was the case that all of Kashmir was to go to India, then Pakistan would cease to have a border with China, so cease to be able to trade meaningfully with China, which is important to Pakistan, is important to China, but also important to India because we'd like to block that if it could. The UK and the Suez Canal, the US and the Panama Canal, I mean, you saw in some ways the decline of the UK around the time that it ceased to control the Suez Canal. Now, that's not to say that the lack of control of the Suez Canal caused the decline of the British Empire, but in some ways it was an important barometer at the point where the British Empire could no longer control something. fundamentally important to its geopolitical interests, namely its ability to trade directly with India through the Suez Canal, against like the Egyptian military, which I guess was impressive to a degree for the time, but probably shouldn't have been able to overpower the largest empire on the planet, meant that clearly the British Empire was in decline. It was a signal that could be kind of presented to anyone else who was acting against it, that it was fair game to advance your interests against the British Empire. That's also in some ways the justification for the British reaction with regards to the Falkland Islands. So you might ask yourself, why on earth Britain would bother to defend a couple of rocks elsewhere in the world, which had like, I don't know, 10,000 people on it. I'm sure it's very nice for the people that live there, but the reason being, if you don't protect your interests, then other people assume that you're not going to protect your interests, which means your interests are more likely to be challenged. Protecting your interests is a good way of ensuring they're not going to be challenged elsewhere. I think it's often worth remembering is a lot of cases, borders between countries are relatively arbitrary because of the historical reasons they were constructed. So the two, I think, most obvious examples of this are the Iraq and Syria border, which was fixed by a British civil servant called Sykes, drawing a line on a map and saying France can have this bit, Britain will have this bit. The line apparently goes from Haifa to Kirkuk, more on Kirkuk in a moment, and the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, which was similarly fixed as a result of actions of British cartographers. And in both cases, there's a significant ethnic group that falls on either side. So in the case of the Iraq-Syrian border, you have Sunni Arabs who are the major ethnic group involved in the ISIS conflict. And the fact that this is such an arbitrary border and there's so much cross-border involvement is a significant factor within that conflict. Similar to Afghanistan-Pakistan, there is a cross-ethnic group in the form of Pashtuns. Pashtuns are both involved in running the state of Afghanistan, but also involved in the Taliban, obviously not necessarily the same Pashtuns. But the fact that the border is both impossible to enforce and is largely not recognized by the people that actually live there is an important factor in the way in which people are able to operate across it. This becomes relevant if you think about the debate that we saw a couple of screens back. So this obviously requires an opening government team to specify what it is that they are sanctioning for. So what are the conditions they want the states to meet, and what are the conditions under which they will say to release the sanctions. My opening government team in that debate had a list of 5 things, one of which they said was they wanted to secure the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as I said to them after the debate, it was unlikely, even though that wasn't one of the grounds upon which they were challenged, it was unlikely to be able to win any challenge to that principle for the simple grounds that seems to be practically infeasible. It seems to be impossible to actually do that. It's hard to imagine a circumstance in which you would be able to secure the border between those two countries because it's so porous and because the people that are involved in it just don't respect that border. You might think that this is a kind of, so this is poor formatting on my part. A lot of the time when people say, well, these borders are arbitrary, therefore we should just like tear them up and start again and create new states. So most obviously, those of you that were at Yale, there was a debate about creating a state of Kurdistan. Similarly, there's occasionally debates about, say, partitioning Iraq, as happened in the Euro semi-final a couple of years ago, or partitioning the Ukraine to deal with the Russian antagonism there. The trouble with this in practice is a lot of the time it involves what I've succinctly called ethnic cleansing here, insofar as even if it's not necessarily the actions of states, often non-state actors, which say just ordinary people, will get involved in trying to push people onto the right side of the border, or alternatively fight over who is the majority group in certain areas that they think are important to them symbolically. So this you think of as the Kosovo/Jerusalem/Kirkuk problem, where in a large number of cases, who controls a particular area is symbolically important to the people living in that area. So there aren't a lot of Serbs in Kosovo, but Serbian control of Kosovo is very meaningful to the Serbs for historical reasons. Similarly, Jerusalem is a divided state in terms of practical reality, or a divided city rather, but in terms of symbolism of who should control it, it's incredibly important to both sides that they retain control of it. Kirkuk, you might not have heard of, but is relevant if you're ever in a Kurdistan debate, insofar as it is a city which has symbolic historical importance to the Kurds, but which is predominantly inhabited by Sunni Arabs. So if they were to try and create a state of Kurdistan, they would probably want Kirkuk to be part of it, but that might cause problems to the people who are living there who don't necessarily want to be part of a state of Kurdistan. So finally, just on borders, ethnic enclaves are often used as a tool of foreign policy independently of the interests of the people that live there. So if we think about the Sudetenland during World War II, this is the German areas of Czechoslovakia. A lot of the German agitation which led to the dismantling of Czechoslovakia was based upon the idea that it was very, very important that the Sudetenland Germans be protected against the I would suggest that this might be controversial, that you see basically the same pattern playing out with Abkhazia, which is the ethnic Russian enclave within Georgia, back when the Russian invasion of Georgia happened in 2008, back then, and Donetsk, Luhansk today. So these are the Russian ethnic areas of Ukraine. So I've had it suggested to me, and it certainly sounds plausible, that this isn't actually with regards to trying to annex those areas, but rather it's a desire to try and, on the part of Russia, to create border tensions, because certain international international bodies, namely NATO, won't allow a state to join if it has contested borders. So by creating an artificial border dispute in Georgia and an artificial border dispute in Ukraine, you effectively block those countries from being able to join NATO. That certainly seems very plausible to me, and in some ways it seems more plausible than the dominant alternative theory that says Russia really, really concerns itself with these areas. But bear in mind, and this is maybe more relevant to considerations we're about to discuss, from the point of view of selling the policy to the people of Russia, it's important that the government does say it is concerned with the interests of Russians within those areas, in much the same way, and I don't want to overstress the analogy here, but in much the same way it was important to try and sell German policy with regards to Czechoslovakia on the basis of concern for the well-being of Sudetenland Germans. Those of you that are particularly into history, you can remember this is also the justification for Bismarck interfering in Schleswig-Holstein, that there was these poor Prussian merchants that were being oppressed by Danes. Economics. So the next two, I think, are, well, actually, no, I've rearranged it from the original draft. So you might think that economics is a separate debate topic. As we discussed with regards to Nigeria debates, that seems not to be the case. But there are certain aspects of economics that are clearly more international relations in their focus. So the first is, historically speaking anyway, the need for supply. So you can see this, for example, with regards to the US relationship with Saudi Arabia. That's obviously significantly inspired by the US desire for a reliable supply of oil, and the activities of China with regards to Africa. So a lot of the reasons that you can point to as to why certain states back up certain other states, say in the UN Security Council, are motivated by a desire to maintain the supply of certain materials which are important to their industry. The second would be, and this is more of a historical one, I suppose, the need for external markets. So if you think about the way in which the British Empire was constructed, in some ways, economically speaking, it was a desire to create artificial customers. So Britain would go around, set up colonies, and sell to those colonies. In some ways, and this is why a lot of this might seem counterintuitive to you, but in some ways, this is why the Indian rebellion against British rule was, it took the form of creating homespun cloth, because the British economic model with regards to its Indian colony was sell them things made in textile mills in the UK. If they're buying, if they're creating their own cloth, then they don't need to buy British wool, British garments, and therefore British garment industry is harmed by doing that. The reason that might seem counterintuitive to you now is you don't necessarily think of the West as being producing garments so much as maybe Asia. But at the time, that was very much the economic model upon which colonialism was based. In some ways, you can see the US in the Cold War is operating in a similar way. That okay, some of it obviously was the desire to try and attain ideological control over certain areas, but some of it was literally a desire to try and maintain markets in places that US goods could be sold to at a time where the US was an exporter of goods as opposed to what it is now, which is primarily an importer. Economic vulnerabilities. So it's important to remember in international relations debates that certain states may be economically vulnerable to other states. Now, you'll notice that both these examples have one thing in common, which is energy. And this tends to be one of the main grounds upon which, like, gross economic vulnerabilities would exist. But the Russian gas supply to Europe is one reason why it becomes difficult for Europe to operate against Russia. It's also one reason why you see so many pipelines as an attempt to rival pre-existing pipelines being established. So there are both attempts to create pipelines that would allow for an alternative non-Russian supply to Western Europe for gas, but also pipelines created that would allow Russia to bypass Ukraine or other states that they might have problems with in order to supply more gas to Europe. So back when which crisis was this? I think it was Georgia. Back when the Georgia crisis happened, the European Union decided to try and sanction Russia then, but Russia reacted by cutting off the gas supply to Western Europe. And under democratic pressure from the German population, and other populations in Europe, but as far as I know, it was primarily the Germans that were the actors here, they were pressured to remove the sanctions. So the reality of the fact that Europe, or at least European consumers, couldn't act without gas supplies because their energy prices skyrocketed, meant that there was only a limited extent to which Europe could meaningfully act against Russia in the form of sanctions. Similarly with regards, so there was a massive recession in much of the developed world in the mid-70s. Does anyone know why? Or I guess early 70s?
Yes. Oil crisis?
What caused the oil crisis?
I believe
The answer may be on the board.
The answer may be on the board.
Oh, the formation of OPEC.
The formation of OPEC. So OPEC, a number of oil-producing countries formed together to create what is effectively a cartel. In fact, it just literally is a cartel, and constrict the supply of oil. And by constricting the supply, increase the price. One thing that's happened more recently, starting in 2014, maybe early 2015, is the OPEC cartel is effectively broken down because Saudi Arabia started its oil, and by overproducing oil, it had an immediate effect in terms of reducing the price of oil. So in other words, reversing the initial OPEC controls. But notice what that does in terms of the international knock-on effect. So suppose you are an oil-producing country and you get, say, 20% of your government revenue from oil, and you're producing, say, 50% of your oil capacity. So you could produce more oil. When Saudi Arabia starts producing more oil and your revenues from oil dip, what do?
You start overproduction.
Yeah. So you start producing more oil as well to try and build up the revenue more. So that means if one state starts overproducing or producing more, other states have to produce more as well. So the production of oil skyrockets everywhere because it becomes unstable. So it's not possible at the moment for Saudi Arabia to reverse this process by just decreasing the amount it's producing because everyone else is overproducing as well. So as a result, I'm just going to use the term overproducing because that means producing relative to its OPEC levels. You just say producing, I suppose, producing more. But that means that if you want to reverse this process, you need to come back to the negotiating table together and multilaterally decrease the production of oil, which is currently the process that the OPEC states are trying to go through. Because the action, whether or not it's been successful in destroying the fracking industry, the action doesn't seem to have been something that's been long-term sustainable. So Saudi Arabia seems to be facing bankruptcy. Signals and credibility. So as I said earlier, this is worth thinking about with reference to maybe the Turkish debate. So I'll try and do that at the end of the segment. So that might be important as a signal that you want to think about whether or not your state is able to do, or actors within the debate are able to do, is consistency. So there's an interesting case that's run in the Koch World's Octo Final by Sydney B. I think you can find this in Vimeo, which just says, so this is about whether or not the West should recognize the Dalai Lama. Hard prop, I think, because there's a lot of very solid arguments against it. But they're able to go through by arguing that the West has taken a stance on human rights issues. And if it has that stance, it needs to be consistent with that stance, because consistency is the currency of international relations. If you're not consistent with your stance, then your stance has no meaning, has no potency. So if you've taken a stance in some areas, you need to take that stance consistently in other areas. I don't know if this is the most immediately true This doesn't seem to be true historically, but it certainly seems to be compelling analysis. You can see reasons why it might be true. And certainly it's therefore something that's worth keeping in the back of your mind, because it did put a team through a World Arctic Final, which is not to be squeaked at. Second, the more obvious cases of signaling would be signaling of potential weakness or potential strength. So if you think about the dominant criticisms of Obama in foreign relations, the thought is that by failure to act decisively in a large number of cases, like for example, within the Arab Spring, he was often consistently criticized for his failure to take decisive action in a number of cases. It signaled a degree of weakness, which means that all of the US's other alliances that require on credibility that the US is willing to take action when action is needed become weaker. So it might seem strange to talk about Egypt when you're in a debate about Taiwan, but you could run, for example, the following argument. The US needs to stand by its allies in Taiwan, because if it doesn't, then the same thing that happened when we failed to step in to protect our allies in the Egyptian regime against the revolution, or alternatively, you think the revolution was good, failed to protect the Muslim Brotherhood against the military coup in the interest of freedom, because other states then see that as weakness and respond to that perceived weakness and assume that the US won't protect their interests in the future. Again, think about the example of the British, of the UK defending the Falkland Islands. The primary concern there, I think, was not necessarily the people and indeed sheep that live in the Falkland Islands so much as a desire to maintain international credibility by saying, look, we're going to protect our interests against potential regional rivals. So one question you should try and think of and have in the back of your head is the question of who the key actor wants to signal. So it might well be that the main actor, again, the main example for me is always going to be Putin, because that's probably the case I've thought more about. But there's probably other instances as well. I'm sure if I knew more about China, then I'd have some very nice Chinese examples. But if you think about, for example, trying to explain to people the justification for actions taken by Russia under Putin, one set of justifications might go, well, he needs to do this in order to signal to other geopolitical rivals that Russia is strong, for example. Or it could well be that his actions have nothing to do with geopolitical rivals, they have everything to do with domestic actors. He wants to signal to, say, the people in the regime immediately surrounding him, who might be in a position to oust him if he seems weak, that he is strong and he's protecting Russian interests. Or it might well be that if the Russian population is facing a recession, as has happened as a result of the decline in oil prices, it might well be that he wants to signal to them that Russia is strong, that they can have pride in the country and so on. This has been one of the dominant narratives to explain why there's been an increase in Russian nationalism. Prices declined, and this can be a narrative that you can avail yourself of in a large number of debates that involve Russia. There's a similar argument with regards to China. So China's economic growth is slowing. Maybe that is a reason for Chinese increased agitation within the South China Sea. Alternatively, it could just be a more direct explanation that it wants the offshore gas that's in the South China Sea in order to drive its industry further. Either of these are plausible explanations for explaining China's actions. Depending on what debate you are in and what you want to try and prove, you might prefer one set of narratives over the other. But the point is, by pointing to the concern that your actor has in signaling specific groups, either external or internal, you make that argument more robust and harder for people to challenge, at least without explaining why your signaling effect either doesn't happen or isn't true. This is important in some cases, and this might require specific knowledge of the countries you're talking about, or at the very least the histories of those countries, when there are certain national fantasies that are relevant here. So I hope this isn't too controversial for people in the live stream, but there's often a degree of confusion about why why Turkey won't recognize the Armenian genocide, because a lot of people think, well, at the point where it wasn't modern Turkey that did it, it was the Ottoman Empire that's dying in its dying years. There doesn't seem to be much cost involved in recognizing it, and it seems to be a pretty obvious case of genocide. I think the best defense that could be given is, well, maybe it was just negligent genocide as opposed to deliberate genocide, but that doesn't seem to be much of a defense. So I would suggest that the reason that the Turkish government is so reluctant to acknowledge it is because there's a national fantasy that is very widespread within Turkey, that if you were to acknowledge the Armenian genocide was a genocide, then the international community would force Turkey to give up a large amount of Anatolia to Armenia. I think the problem with this is it just seems to be fantastical. Like I don't see how this would ever happen. So it does seem that weird that a part of foreign policy would be motivated by what seems to be a relatively absurd belief on the part of the Turkish population, or at least a segment of the Turkish population, that a geopolitical consequence would follow from this recognition. But if it is sufficiently widespread, and the Turkish government has more interest in what the Turkish population think about this than what the international community think about this, then it seems obvious they would just go with the Turkish population. So in other words, if there are people that think these things, and this is maybe not like completely incredible, we can imagine maybe there being a case for some form of international reparations if genocide was recognized. So maybe it's not as fantastical as I say it is. The British government would not acknowledge it, and would indeed discourage other states like the US from pressuring them to acknowledge it, purely motivated by domestic concerns for what the population think. Similar with regards to India, Pakistan, depending on what side in the debate you are, you might want to argue that the military are the people that have beliefs, credible or otherwise, about the motivations of the other side of the conflict, or you might argue it's the population. In the case of, say, India, if it is the population that have severe antagonism towards Pakistan, it's very difficult for the Indian government to be able to get away from that. Whereas if it's, say, the military, or if it's, say, just the ruling party within India, then it's much easier to be able to dismiss those concerns and say, well, look, that means you can get around this problem and so on. So depending on what side you were on an India-Pakistan motion, you might want to create a different narrative that explains the hostility between those states, and therefore explains how it is that actors could react in relation to that antagonism. Just very briefly, escalation versus mutually assured destruction. I mean, when we think about escalation, escalation is primarily a signaling mechanism. So I asked some people I'm in a group thread with on Facebook who are IR scholars, for lack of a better word, if they could think of first principles in IR, and they didn't give me any first principles, they gave me lots of maxims. So this is actually a quote from, what have we got? It's not Scarface, is it? The one about Al Capone, maybe it's called Capone. If they bring a knife, you bring a gun, they send one of yours to the hospital, you send one of theirs to the morgue. Ironically, it does capture very nicely the logic of 10 minutes. The logic of escalation, which is to say, it captures the idea that the way around mutually assured destruction that people discovered, namely Henry Kissinger, was that you can have controlled escalation that might even include nuclear escalation if it's kept on a small scale and if it is controlled, which is to say that you act disproportionately to how others act towards you in a way of deterring their future actions against you, but you make it clear that if they stop, you will stop. And so it means whenever anyone, you essentially get locked into a game of international chicken. So as a result of sinking a ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, if that happens, you get an invasion of a country and these kind of things. So it might be successful in deterring international conflict. Alternatively, if the other side don't stop and they re-escalate, it might be that next step up the wedge that eventually results in global thermonuclear warfare, which presumably both sides want to avoid. So governing coalitions. Again, I think we've covered some of this already, but it's important to remember that whether or not you're dealing with a democracy or you're dealing with a dictatorship, you are still dealing with a country that has a number of decision makers, not merely one individual. These are absolute monarchies are by and large gone, and even then there was some degree of pressure that willingly could impose upon the monarch. So this might take the form of, say, a ruling bargain, which is to say certain expectations the population have. So this is, I think, what was being alluded to earlier with regards to petrostates, like Saudi Arabia and so on, providing services for the population. The population has a certain expectation of what it can reasonably expect the state to provide it with. And if these expectations are not met, those tend to be the conditions under which there might be revolution. Second, the army in most states, especially in non-democratic states, is a very important decision maker. Whether or not you have the army on side is often what determines whether or not your regime will survive, and second, whether or not a revolution against the state will be able to win against it. I think in these cases, it's often important to remember that the international actions towards the state can sometimes be a key tipping point there. So with the Libyan revolution, it was an important decisive factor in whether certain army groups went over to the side of the rebels or stuck with the government, what the international community did. You saw a large number of who presumably were fence-sitting rebels or potential rebels going over to the rebel side after the international community voted to take even minimal international actions in the form of setting up a no-fly zone over Libya. The reason being that was an important signal, I think, to those people that effectively the government was doomed, that ultimately the rebels would be the ones who emerged successful. Because the one thing you don't want to be is on the losing side of a civil conflict. So in other words, if you're a battalion commander, you have to decide, do I stick with the government because I think the rebels are going to lose, or do I go with the rebels because I think the government is going to lose? You have until midway through the conflict to make your decision. How the international community signals what the inevitable result of that conflict will be is important to you. Presumably also is the risk of reprisals. One reason why you might be surprised that so many people have stuck with the Assad government given what the Assad government have done. But a realistic concern of the people that are backing up the Assad government in many cases is that there's going to be some form of ethnic cleansing or other forms of reprisals in the event the rebels lose against the Alawite population. So that's why he maintains incredible loyalty amongst the Alawites and other potentially vulnerable ethnic groups, because they fear what will happen if the rebels who are predominantly Sunni. Important to remember with regards to this, that most people are not necessarily revolutionaries. Revolutions require both means in the form of being able to actually conduct the revolution, and often that's why revolutions happen when there's an economic upswing, where people have access to more resources to fund things like revolutions. But second, they also require motive, and they require a broad swathe of motive. So you probably need something like the circumstances that led to the Egyptian uprising, where you've got a large number of well-educated, relatively affluent people frustrated because of the levels of unemployment in the country, frustrated because there doesn't seem to be a pathway for the country to develop further, and feeling that the ruling elite is both moribund, but at the same time suppressing the potential for either you to realize the state that you want, if you're an Islamist, or alternatively you being able to progress in the state because you feel that the military is essentially taken over all the opportunities that exist for upward advancement in the state. Those are probably the circumstances in which you get large-scale rebellion. Ethnic division, I mean, the worry here is that a lot of the time debaters have a tendency towards very reductive explanations of ethnic conflict, but ethnic conflict are often an important factor to understand with regards to states. So I think this is where resources like this here, or alternatively the Oxford Credit World countries, can be handy, because a lot of the time what might seem like a very naive explanation of ethnic interrelationships within a state sounds much less naive if you can provide some account of the historical explanation for why these divides exist and why they might persist. So some explanation, for example, of, to use the second example, the divide and rule structure that existed in a large number of colonial states. So a lot of the reason, for example, the antagonism between the Tutsis and Hutus goes back to structures that were developed as a means of ruling states from a distance with a fairly small number of non-native, I suppose, but a small number of home country soldiers in those states was contingent upon creating a ruling elite that would fear the reprisal if the majority was able to win, but at the same time was able to be presented as, well, these are the superior people. So, I mean, this is probably worse in states ruled by Belgium, but nonetheless it's found in other states as well. Neo-patriotism, so it's a kind of fancy way of saying the way in which resources are often distributed along ethnic lines in states is also worth understanding how a lot of these ethnic antagonisms develop over time. So the antagonism towards Sunni Arabs on the part of the Shia during the Saddam regime, and indeed towards Shia Arabs under the now predominantly Shia regime that gave rise to some of the popular support for ISIS in the East, is largely one based on resource distribution, feeling that the other ethnic group are getting more than their fair share. It's worth remembering that in some cases, this is why I said poison perceptions, these perceptions persist even if it's fair. So even if there is a fairness of distribution of things like schools, hospitals, bridges, and so on, there's still going to be that feeling that the other side is getting a fairer share in a number of cases. So it might well be that once antagonisms are in place, it's very difficult to manage those antagonisms in a way that is able to convince everyone that the outcome is fair. It's a very good book that attempts to popularize these. You might be familiar with Paul Collier's Bottom Billion, but the popularizing version of Bottom Billion seems to be written primarily for people doing political statistics rather than a popular audience. So it's a very strange bestseller. But there's a follow-up book he wrote called Wars, Guns and Votes that explains some of the data in Bottom Billion in much more narrative form. And important for that is the explanation that says neo-patrimonialism happens a lot in the poorer states where a lot of the income comes from natural resource production or international aid and is then redistributed along ethnic lines in order to maintain stability within those states. The problem being that if you wanted to say, well, democracy is always the best answer, democracy is often unstable in those states precisely because situation in which whoever controls the government controls the economy. And that means elections are often winner take all. There's a feeling that just doesn't exist in developed states that whether or not your guy is able to maintain control determines whether or not you can feed your children, determines whether or not you're going to be literally destitute for the rest of your life. And so this is why it's very easy to motivate post-electoral violence in large number of countries, why you get a lot of kind of civil war or close to civil war situations like has happened in Kenya, like has happened in the Ivory Coast. A lot of the time it's the fact that people within those states see the election as being something that's determining their long-term livelihood and as a result are willing to take arms to defend the status quo, which doesn't happen in states where, as you were saying earlier, there's more development, there's more of a middle class, the economic wealth is more divided. Just briefly on that, a few thoughts. Oh, whoops. This is obviously more in terms of development, but just kind of to think of the conditions for stable growth that might be relevant to a lot of international relations debates. A lot of the time we concern ourselves with stability in part because that's one of the things that's going to be able to maintain investment. Along these lines, this is just a passing thought that maybe I shouldn't say. I'm slightly bemused by all the antagonism towards what's called investor-state dispute settlement, which is one of the features of international trade agreements. So as a feature of NAFTA, it was going to be a feature of the TTP and the TTIP. I mean, the honesty there is, people are like, well, it's incredibly unreasonable that investors would be able to sue a state. And you're like, well, no, it isn't. You don't have any pre-existing rights to investment any more than someone who's complaining of being friend-zoned has some kind of rights to sexual favors, right? It's entirely reasonable investors will want to have some way of maintaining the security of their investment, under which, if they don't get it, they won't invest. So the argument in favor of ISDS is you actually get more investment as a result of it because people feel more secure in their investment, whereas otherwise they might just maintain it at home. Investor-state dispute settlement. It's the name given for the arbitration process that's built into a lot of these international trade disputes. As we said earlier, you might want to have a middle class because you might want to have a more distributed basis of your economy. And also that helps block out the kind of hostility you often get when you have winner-take-all, very centralized economic structures. Often, this is one of those weird things where the pre-existence of a middle class is often necessary for democracy to be functional, but at the same time, often the existence of a democratic state is useful for being able to make a wider base of the economy out with the state, because otherwise the government left to its own devices might well centralize all the economic activity to it. A good example of that, I think, might be just at the very bottom of the screen. Military aid to Egypt had a very strange, unforeseen consequence. So under the terms of the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, Egypt gets the same level of military aid as Israel does. The trouble is, because Egypt was a military state, that aid went to the government, effectively, by going to the military. And as a result, the military was able to buy out large chunks of the Egyptian economy because it just ran out of other things to spend money on, so started buying businesses. So as a result, the Egyptian military owned something like 40% of the entire economy, which makes it very difficult to access, right? This is one of the reasons the Egyptian military maintained incredible levels of power even after the Muslim Brotherhood took over, because they own so much of the state. So you might think, similarly here, space to develop your own method of economy is important. So I don't want to go too much into international economics. It's done better in other lectures you can find online. But just making the noisy, uncontroversial claim that even when benign, international economic bodies sometimes have geopolitical interests that cause their advice to be either, one, not as uninterested as it might seem, or second, not necessarily good advice in all cases. So the obvious example of this would be the IMF encouraging people to adopt an export-driven model. At times this might be good advice, but obviously, one, this arguably serves the interests more of the West in terms of these states being effectively producer states for the West. But secondly, it turned out to be incredibly bad advice when the 2008 financial recession happened and the West started importing much less. So if you were a primarily export-driven state and suddenly your export market stopped importing things, that was really bad for you. And it was one of the reasons why there was a knock-on effect to the financial crisis within Africa, that so many of those states were dependent upon Western states importing their produce because they'd been told by various development agencies that this was the correct way to model their economy if they wanted to maximize growth. I will skip leverage to some extent. Leverage is an important thing to think about just in terms of the way that different states interact with each other in international relations generally, but I don't think there's necessarily much that we haven't covered implicitly to add there. Blowback, I think this is the last slide, so Rory will be pleased. Blowback I just want to introduce as a possible alternative term to backlash in international relations, because it's important to be able to separate different forms of backlash out. So blowback's a perfectly good term for backlash in international relations. So we might think about domestic blowback in the form of saying, a lot of the time, historically, there's been negative responses on the part of domestic populations to, say, Westernization. So a lot of the explanation for why the Shah was overthrown can be explained in part by the fact that the domestic population of Iran was not necessarily that keen upon what seemed to be the Westernization that was part of the regime. So this might be harder for people from Western states to conceptualize, but in large parts of the country, the West is seen as a source of decadence and corruption. So a lot of the time, domestic corruption that might actually be caused by entirely other things, so economic factors, ends up being blamed upon increasing decadence that comes from exposure to the West. And so Westernization starts to seem a barometer for all the things that are happening in your life that are going badly. And it's why in a lot of these states, if the ruling regime, which is seen as Westernizing, is overthrown, there's a return to more traditional forms of rule. A second thing which is relevant here is the fact that especially within debating, this might be an oversimplistic way of looking at things, but there is a kind of a theory that suppression will radicalize people, which is why people find it very difficult to prop the Malaysia quarterfinal, which essentially argued for the merits of suppressing Islamism in a large number of Arab countries. Very plausible, I think, historically, to say that the net effect of the suppression of Islam within Egypt was a fundamental radicalization of political Islam, which probably hasn't been beneficial, both in terms of just the Muslim Brotherhood, but also it's worth remembering that one of the co-founders of Al-Qaeda is in fact an Egyptian Muslim who sought to, or not going to call him Muslim, but like an Egyptian who sought to ultimately overthrow the Egyptian government. Like al-Zarqawi's main interest was eventually taking over Egypt. And this other theory, which I'm not sure has as much historical credibility, but rule moderates. So the idea that if you were to say, get the Muslim Brotherhood in power, or you would say, have Hamas in power, it would moderate them because they would be forced to deal with political realities, and those positions would be harder to be extremist under those circumstances. Again, I'm not sure entirely how much historical credibility that has, but it does have some credibility if you look to, say, countries like Northern Ireland, where as a result of the ruling deal there, radical factions on either side of the conflict have been forced to share power, and by sharing power have suppressed the extreme radical ends of their own communities. So the IRA effectively has been in government in the form of Sinn Féin, and the result does seem to have been a massive decrease in radicalization on the Catholic side. So spillover. Spillover is a form of blowback which is particularly relevant to international relations space. If we think of the way in which you should be concerned about actions in one country because they will affect other countries. One example that we've already discussed in passing is the fact that Boko Haram now seems to be operating within Cameroon. Another example might well be an unforeseen consequence of the Libyan intervention was that a number of mercenaries that were operating for the Gaddafi regime were now free to expand into other areas. And the place they decided to expand into was Mali. So the Mali conflict that happened in, I think, 2012, 2013, was in some ways the direct consequence of the Libyan intervention. Now, I'm not saying that it's necessarily an argument against the Libyan intervention, but it is worth considering when you're thinking about both international relations debates in general, but specifically international relations debates that involve intervention within countries, what the possible spillover justifications might be. You might be acting to try and prevent spillover, but alternatively, your actions might cause a form of spillover if factions that are part of the ruling regime there are effectively free to expand into other areas. A similar form of spillover that's particularly increasingly important in debates at the very least is refugees. So two non-obvious sources of refugees. The Rohingya, who are a predominantly Muslim ethnic group, have been spreading throughout a large number of the bordering states within the region, and indeed as far as Australia out, because of suppression by the predominantly Buddhist population within Myanmar. Second, Eritrea, as a result of authoritarianism. So a lot of the refugees that are currently going to Europe are not coming from Syria, they're actually coming from Eritrea, which might not be obvious, but they traditionally would go to Israel, but Israel closed its borders with Egypt, which prevented that movement. So as a result, the Eritreans who were fleeing Eritrea have now been forced west, and by being forced west, have been forced into Europe via human smuggling routes in Libya. So a lot of the people that you see described as refugees settling in Germany turn out to be Eritreans as opposed to being Syrians. So this might, for example, if there is ever debates about intervening in Eritrea, this might be a compelling reason as to why you might think that a large number of states have an interest in doing that. A lesser well-known refugee crisis, but still a very important one. Skip Venezuela. So I mean, Venezuela is just a way of thinking in practical terms about spillover risk. For those of you who are at the European Venue Championships, one reason why other Latin American countries might have justified intervening in Venezuela is if you thought that the situation was becoming worse, such that the two choices were either a spillover risk if the regime starts to fail entirely, or alternatively a US intervention. So the argument as to why Latin American countries would do it would be to block out a potential US intervention. Or at the very least, that's the best proper argument I can think of. So I think this is the last page I have. Yes, it is. We're very pleased. Just in terms of running through standard tools of enforcement that you have within international relations, and it's probably worth researching these as much as it is worth researching actual context, because you can get basic information about context from reference sources. You can't get basic information about tools that have been used in the past. So international organizations might be able to act. Which Huber debate? Oh yes, sorry. There was a debate at the Huber debates in Vermont recently which said, wouldn't it be nice if we could set up an international body that could fine states for bad actions? And the answer to that question is, yes, it would be, but the trouble with that is it needs to be tied into something else. So I think prop teams that correctly foresaw that was an issue and tied it into, say, membership of the United Nations did very well. Whereas other prop teams that said, well, it'll just be a thing and you can sign up and it'll be great, tends to do very badly because there's no obvious reason as to why you would want to be a membership of this body if the only possible advantage was it allows other people to sue you. This is kind of the problem that the ICC has at the moment, that it's not very easy to see what the benefits of being part of the ICC are. It's very easy to see what the potential consequences are, which is it might allow people that are part of your country to be, taken to The Hague and tried for war crimes, which is not very attractive to the very countries that we ideally would want to be in a position that could be taken to the ICC, taken to The Hague and tried for war crimes. This, in some ways, the problem with the the permanent nations, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, and the historical problem of the League of Nations. So everyone, I think, agrees that having a certain number of countries able to veto decisions of the UN is not in and of itself desirable. Like, it's obviously led to cases where China can protect Sudan, the US can prevent action against Israel, France can interfere with interventions in Rwanda, but it's not very good in terms of the UN being able to do its job. But the possible alternative is what happened with the League of Nations. If very powerful states are not able to achieve and protect their interests through international bodies, they have no reason whatsoever to actually engage with and obey those international bodies, which is basically what happened with the League of Nations. The superpowers of the world ignored the actions of the League of Nations and the edicts of the League of Nations, and therefore the League of Nations stopped being taken seriously and dissolved. So in some ways, the permanent member status of certain states in the UN Security Council is the trade-off you get in order to incentivize those states to actually be involved with the United Nations as a project and respect the United Nations because they're able to protect its regimes. Just in terms of thinking about principles within debating, that often means that international relations has an unfortunate trade-off between principles and reality. So you can see this most obviously in the ICC. One of the justifications that Kenya gave for why it was building out the ICC was implicitly racist, because it only tends to prosecute African heads of state. The reality is it tends to prosecute African heads of state because it can't go after anyone else. So it can't really go after China, it can't go after the Bush regime in America. So there are these practical trade-offs that a lot of the time happen, which means that in the same way as a lot of the time in, say, criminal justice debates, a stark, purely principled case will fall based on the realities that in practice we often have compromises of our principles are also going to fall in international relations debates for the very same reason. It's very difficult to see a principle on the international stage that is not compromised in at least some cases. And in some ways rowing into that and say, well, this is a principle that should guide our behavior, but doesn't necessarily dominate in all cases. Here's why we think in this case it definitely should apply. There's maybe a more robust way to think about arguing those cases. Sanctions, in some ways this is one where I'm just saying, well, go off and Google these yourself. But a couple of notes to think about here. So one, there may or may not exist such a thing as smart sanctions. It's worth reading up on debates about whether or not they exist and the role that they may arguably have played in bringing down the apartheid regime in South Africa, because you can find academics arguing both sides of the issues very compellingly. Worth remembering, and this is, I think, relatively well known, but still might be counterintuitive to some people. A lot of the time, the regime that is sanctioned benefits from sanctions domestically. So one reason for this is the extent to which, by constraining external sources of revenue, you essentially force people to be more dependent upon centralized forms of revenue coming from the regime. So in other words, if you harm economic activity in the state generally, it means that the economic activity which is happening tends to be more centralized, and that tends to be controlled by the regime. So an example of this, which is maybe not obvious, is sanctions on electronic goods in Iran actually caused the Revolutionary Guard Corps to be more affluent than it was previously, because they were the only people that could import things like satellite dishes that the middle class wanted, and therefore the middle class had to buy their satellite dishes from the Revolutionary Guard Corps because they were the people that were able to import despite the sanctions. And so a lot of the time, and similarly, so for the example of aid organizations in Sudan, sometimes benign actors can be complicit in sanction busting. So a number of international aid organizations that were banned from Sudan bribed their way into the country, but the people they ended up bribing were the people who were helping to conduct the genocide in Darfur. This has been a very good example, but weirdly enough didn't come up in the 2015 WUDC Final. So aid organizations sometimes end up being complicit in propping up the very things they're trying to prevent by virtue of acting as de facto sanction busters if they're banned from a country and want to pay their way in. Interventions.
Yes. Instructions. You've got literally instructions to say you shouldn't go on past half time.
Okay. So I've got like
why interventions fail might take more than a substantial period of time.
Okay. We've already discussed tipping points. I promise there's a couple more sentences. Just go on the slide. So I recommend a book by someone called Linda Coleman called "We Did Nothing." The UNCY peacekeepers, not necessarily the perfect actor. So these are forms of peace management. Consociationalism is also something that might be worth Googling. So consociationalism is, broadly speaking, where you try and solve a lot of the ethnic tensions that exist in states by forcing ethnic groups to work together. So one example of this, which seems to be relatively successful, is forcing the parties representing the communities in Northern Ireland to work together as a single government. It has had the weird consequence that because people wanted their interests best represented, they voted for the most extreme parties representing each of the communities, but they do seem to have formed a stable government. And on the other side of the equation, we have Lebanon, where the constitution was designed in such a way as to block any particular ethnic group having majority. But it does seem the response to that and the frustrations that go with that have been that it's led to increasing popularity of extremist groups from the Christian community and from the Sunni Muslim communities. So I think Hezbollah is Sunni, right? Hezbollah might be Shia. As polls suggest, if it was the case that you had a free election for a president as opposed to an election that constricts president to being a Maronite Christian, it's highly likely that Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, would win those elections, which is not necessarily good for ethnic tensions within Lebanon. So this is in some ways the suppression equals radicalization example again. So as Rory said, there's lots to be said on interventions, probably can't be said in -3 minutes. What I would say is think about having a list of interventions and thinking about why specifically those interventions failed. So a lot of the times debates on interventions don't necessarily go deeper than intervention within Iraq didn't necessarily work. I think it's useful to try and think about specifically why various interventions failed. There's an incredibly good documentary on Iraq called No End in Sight, which explains the role that various decisions that were made during the process of managing the post-intervention Iraq state led to the growth of the insurgency. So, for example, the decision to disband the Iraqi army in the process known as debathification was one of the main things that led to the insurgency, because rather unsurprisingly, though apparently it came as a surprise to them, if you render a large number of people who are trained in the use of military weapons and who have control over the stockpiles of military weapons within the country, both unemployed and unemployable, they are going to take up arms and fight you. And that caused arguably a insurgency that you can still see the tail ends of now, insofar as a large number of the people that were part of Bedouin Sudan seem to be involved in ISIS.
What's it called again? What's it called again?
No End in Sight. Off the top of my head, remember the name of the filmmaker, but he's produced other documentaries that are also really good. Cool. So with -4 minutes to go, that's all I have to say. If you have any questions, I can certainly answer them, but probably not on the live stream, because I think we have to leave the building. But I can answer them as a red-in staircase.
Duncan, can I see the book cover?
Thanks.
You might check whether your library has a copy, because like Vermont does. It surprised me, but.
Was 8 now, so
No, you're on. You got to chill.
I've been on purpose. So.